Hi everybody, this is an ongoing series examining the dungeon design in Zelda games. We've already taken a look at all of Ocarina of Time's dungeons, so go check that out if you'd like. Otherwise, let's hop into Majora's Mask. Last time we covered the game's opening and its first dungeon, Woodfall Temple. In the interest of giving yourself an adequate amount of time, keep in mind the 3-day time limit here, most people are probably going to go ahead and travel back in time to the first day before heading towards the next dungeon. If you do so, Tattle will chime in with a hint that the mountains are directly north of Clocktown. As usual, there's some side quests you may want to do before heading up that way in order to stock up on some heart pieces. My favorites include the archery minigames, which we can do now that we have the bow. It's also worth stopping at the bomb shop in West Clocktown and buying a bomb bag if you have not already. As useful as the blast mask is, actual bombs will be needed for at least one particular part of the upcoming dungeon. If you head out the north gate, you'll see the path up towards the mountain is blocked by these huge ice crystals. But now that we have the bow, we can shoot the ice shards dangling above here to cause this huge icicle to come crashing down and clear the path. Great. Heading up the mountain trail is pretty straightforward. It's as linear a path as it gets. There are several instances along the path, however, where you'll want to use either bombs or the blast mask to break these large snowballs in order to progress. Once we make it up the path, we'll find the mountain village. Well, this area is sure called the mountain village, but there is all of one entire building here. That's the blacksmith. We'll come back to that later. So what's the deal with this snowy mountain anyways? Well, much in the same fashion as the swamp, which was poisoned, the mountain is frozen over, despite the fact that it should be spring. It's so cold, in fact, that there are Gorons who are straight up freezing in place where they stand, including this old geezer. Hey, while we're here, I want to mention the music. Something Majora's Mask soundtrack does really well is having distinct music for each area, which are all re-instrumentations of the same song. Since the track changes to the field theme after the curse is lifted from each area, I'll refer to these tracks as the cursed area themes just for simplicity's sake. The Swamp's cursed music had a very suiting track that mostly featured this twangy sounding string instrument. The Mountain's curse theme changes this up to feature droning wind sounds, some kind of bells which hit a pretty high pitch, giving a very ice-themed vibe, and some piano underneath all of that, paired with some choir voices. It is sort of reminiscent of the Ice Cavern theme from Ocarina of Time in this instrumentation, but while the overall theme of that track was quite tranquil, the Cursed Mountain theme does its job by giving us a track that seems to be going specifically for an uncomfortable, hopeless, desolate sort of feeling. Also, shout out to the bass in this track. I think it's an upright bass. It's just got such a punchy feeling underneath all of that howling wind and echoing bells. Moving on, we'll need to head through this bridge area from the eastern side of the mountain and find our way to Goron Village. We'll find our old pal Kebora Gabora over here at the end of the village. Okay, so he actually did show up in the swamp as well to teach you the Song of Soaring, but I didn't mention it in the last video. Despite my feelings towards this guy, he's actually not too obnoxious. It seems like they really toned him down in this game. He'll ask that you follow him to the shrine across the gap here, and he'll say not to be daunted by appearances, and instead trust your feelings. Okay, Obi-Wan, what this really means is that there are invisible platforms here that you can jump on in order to cross the gorge and over to the shrine. If you're not sure about these platforms, his feathers will land in place to guide you as well. Quick mention, even though we've actually never been there yet, I really like that stone tower is fully visible from here, and looking at the overworld map, that makes total sense. It's one of those tiny details that if they never included it, you would never know or be bothered, but the fact that they did really goes to show the attention to detail that makes these games so great. Anyways, in the shrine, we'll find the Lens of Truth. It functions exactly as it did in Ocarina of Time. So, returning from the shrine, we can now see those invisible platforms. We also will now be able to see this Goron ghost here. He's surprised we can see him, though he is skeptical, saying that if we truly can see him, we should follow him. There's a bit of a sequence here where we have to follow him all the way back to the main mountain village area, which mostly is just annoying because he kind of moves slowly. Once you follow him up this long climb, you'll find yourself at his grave. He explains that he is Darmani, a Goron hero, and that he died marching off to Snowhead Temple to see if there was a way to put an end to the blizzard, when said blizzard blew him right off the cliff and to his death. His dialogue here is pretty gut-wrenching. This line in particular I always found to be pretty powerful. As I am, I can only watch as Goron Village is slowly buried in ice. I may have died, but I cannot rest. Yikes, dude. He requests that since you can use magic, that you please bring him back to life so that he may save his people. And if you can't do that, to at least heal his sorrows in some way. So what we'll need to do is play him the Song of Healing. We get this nice cutscene of Darmani seeing himself surrounded by his people as he finds peace in the afterlife, and his soul can finally rest. The Goron mask is created, which contains his spirit. Now, just like the Deku mask, we can transform back and forth into Goron form at any time. Goron Link's ability are pretty well what you'd expect. He throws powerful punches and can roll around. He's also much stronger than Link's Hylian form, being able to push blocks that are normally too heavy. In a way, the mask is a combination of the Megaton Hammer and the Silver Gauntlets from Ocarina of Time, with a sweet new rolling ability added in here. A nice detail here, inscribed in Darmani's grave are the controls for how to use Goron Link's abilities, which is a great optional, if not slightly fourth wall breaking way to do it. We next need to move his grave aside to reveal this hot spring and fill a bottle with hot spring water in order to be able to melt things. I love this moment of dialogue when you thaw out this Goron and he notices that you're Darmani, who should be dead. It's a nice bit of comedy. Okay. Quick rundown of what needs doing. We visit the Goron village to find the elder's son is crying because he misses his dad. We'll find his dad frozen just outside the village here. Thaw him out and he'll teach you the first part of the Goron lullaby to play to his son. Unfortunately, he can't remember the rest of the song. Play what we have of the song for the kid and he'll teach you the rest of it. While you're here, make sure to light these torches and break the chandelier to find some rock roast, which you can give to this stranded Goron out by the smithy to get the Don Garros mask. That's for later though. We can now head up this path, Goron roll our way through this track, and we'll find ourselves up at the peak of Snowhead, the source of the blizzard. If you use the Lens of Truth, you'll see that there is a giant Goron here blocking the way and blowing wind down the mountain. So we'll need to play him the Goron lullaby to put him to sleep, and oh, he fell right off the mountain. Sorry, buddy. Now we can make our way up the narrow path which winds around this huge structure, and we'll finally be able to make it into Snowhead Temple. Talking about dungeons in this game, I hear a lot of people compare the game's third dungeon, Great Bay Temple, to Ocarina of Time's Water Temple, which, based on them both having a water theme, that seems adequate on a surface level. But in my opinion, when examining the structure and progression of the dungeon itself, I feel like the comparison is much stronger for Snowhead Temple here. Like the Water Temple, Snowhead is built around a large central room with many floors, basically a big vertical structure. Just like how you need to raise and lower the water level in that dungeon, here you're raising and lowering this huge platform in the central room in order to be able to progress through here, which of course can only be done from certain spots in the dungeon. Everything else branches off from this large room as well, with tons of doors. There's also some puzzles that you have to start and then abandon until later on in the dungeon. It's not water themed, sure, but I think the comparison is stronger when looking at how you make your way through this place and then face off against the boss at the very top floor. One thing that this dungeon does improve upon over the Water Temple temple is that it color codes its doors, which is something the 3DS remake would later adopt for the water temple. This goes a long way to keeping you from getting lost while navigating the enormous structure. Snowhead is a huge dungeon. There are a whopping 5 floors, and many of the rooms are pretty darn big. Just like before, there will also be 15 stray fairies to find here, many of which you'll want the lens of truth for. Often, it's pretty easy to find the in-universe cultural ties in a dungeon, but Snowhead had me kind of stumped initially. There isn't a lot of architectural flair to go off of like there was for Woodfall, but in a way, that actually could be an indicator to tie this to the Gorons. Not just because the Gorons live on this mountain, but because most Goron structures are known to be carved out of stone, which seems to be the case for this place too. When there is brick, it's usually not particularly ornate either. There are also a bunch of these switches which you need to use your Goron pounding ability to press down as well. So yeah, I'm gonna go with that. It's most likely that Gorons built this place. As usual, a quick mention to the music here. Dang if it isn't uncomfortable. Just like outside, we get this cold feeling wind howling, and over top of that is this shattering sound. The only thing I can think of is that it kind of sounds like it could be icicles dropping down and shattering, which is something that happens in this dungeon a lot. Next is the piano, and it's pretty minimalist, but it keeps banging on these low notes, which adds a sense of tension that carries through most of the track. And then there's the main portion of the song here. It's so tense and uptight feeling, and it never feels like the tension releases here. And again, there's some weird banging background noise. Not sure how to define it, but just like Woodfall, it gives me the feeling like there is danger just around the corner. The only other thing is the chanting choir voices, which thematically do tie it a bit to the Cursed Mountain theme. When you first enter the dungeon, you'll be ambushed in the foyer by a bunch of white bows. We met their shadowy counterparts in Woodfall, who all lived in dark areas. So the impression I get is that this type of bow evolved to camouflage in snow instead of hiding in the shadows. It's a weird detail, but yeah, you'll need to use Goron Link's strength to push this big block out of the way. The second part of the foyer presents us with 3 doors. The light blue one on the left is locked, the red center door is frozen over, the dark right side door is the only viable option. A white Wolfos will also ambush you here. You can choose to ignore him, but I'd like to quickly mention how satisfying it is to land a Goron punch on these guys. The second room has a broken bridge with a ramp that we need to use our Goron roll to jump across. Before you do that, however, there's a couple of stray fairies in the bottom section of the room that you should grab. Once you get across the bridge, there's 2 ways to go from here, through the side door or up the staircase. You don't have to yet, but I do suggest going up the staircase into this square room with the bomb chew first. There isn't much to do in here just yet, but it is worth stopping in to grab the stray fairy and open the treasure chest with the dungeon map. Now heading back and through that blue side door will take us into the dungeon's large central room. There's a lot of doors here, 7 just on this floor. So much like the water temple, try not to get overwhelmed in here with the sheer volume of options. The best place to start is to go across the room and through the yellow door. There's some blocks you can pull which have a treasure chest with our first hidden key here. While you're here, make sure to push the blocks all the way to the other side of the room. A treasure chest will appear on the ledge, so it's out of reach, but we'll come back for it later. Now that we have a key, we can head back into the central room. You may recall one of the rooms in the foyer needing a key, so we'll head back there. The red door here that's frozen can be thawed out by shooting an arrow through the torch beside it, giving us a nice shortcut between the central room and the foyer. Did I mention loving these color-coded doors yet? because I do. Okay, back in the foyer, we can unlock that third door and head into the next room. This room has some huge ice chunks, which have some switches and blocks frozen in them, so remember that for later. There's a treasure chest in here, which will give us the compass. There are also 2 white wolfos to fight in here as well, but you can take them on one at a time, since they won't go too far from where they spawn in. Earlier, I mentioned that you'll want actual bombs, and this is where you need it. There is a stray fairy in that crate on the ledge. You'll want to throw a bomb and time it just right so that it explodes in mid-air to release the fairy. Right beside it, between the 2 pillars, is a pretty obvious looking bombable wall as well. So you can use another bomb or the blast mask to blow that up and reveal the staircase up to the next room. This next room has these platforms with icicles. Much like how we opened the path up to the mountain before, we'll use the bow to shoot the icicles off the ceiling and clear the path. There's a hidden alcove with a stray fairy, which you can use the lens of truth to see. But in all honesty, it's so obvious even without it. Not just because of the wall texture, but you can even see on the mini-map that there's a treasure chest hidden there. There's some cash to grab in here, but most importantly, break this snow boulder to reveal a second treasure chest, which contains the key you'll need for the locked door on the other end of the room. Next up is this switch room. Real quick mention, but this is the room with the most well-hidden stray fairy, which you'll only be able to see using the lens of truth if you look up at the ceiling. A huge block of ice is blocking the main path, so in order to get to the other door, we need to sort out this puzzle. There's 4 switches, but when you press each one down, it will force other switches back up. They are also color-coded, so that does help. So here's the solution to this puzzle. Pound down the first yellow switch, which forces up the other 2. This allows us to jump across the gap onto the other ledge. On the other side of the ledge, pound down the upper green switch, which will raise the lower green one. Now go back to the yellow one that we used as a bridge and pound it down too. This will lower the one blocking the door. Now we can climb back up the lower green one, which we raised, and we'll be able to get through the door, no problem. This takes us back into the main central room, but on the second floor. The layout here is pretty straightforward. Including the door we just came in, there are 4 doors in each cardinal direction. The northern door is frozen over, so that just leaves the 2 side doors. Like before, we need to Goron roll to jump the gap. We'll land on the blocked off north side, so we need to roll along this slope along the side of the room to make it to the east door. There's a bit of forgiveness here if you do fall. There's a sort of safety net allowing us to climb back to the north side and try again. Through the east door, we'll be back on the upper ledge of the room where we got the map, but don't worry about that just yet. Instead, we'll need to once more Goron roll to the west end of the central room and through that door. It's mid-boss time. We have a quick combat challenge against a Wizrobe. He's not too tough. There's these platforms in the room that he'll pop up from and try to shoot ice at you, but if you stand in the corner of the room and keep your bow at the ready, you'll be able to snipe him before he has a chance to strike. The second phase of the fight, he'll have some duplicates running around, but you can use the same tactic to just finish him off, which is even easier because the real one will show up as a red blip on your minimap. Land enough arrows and he'll go down. This fight rewards us with a chest containing the dungeon item, fire arrows. I really enjoy having this as the dungeon item because it takes the idea of the bow being the previous dungeon item, and rather than throwing something completely different our way, it builds on what the bow is capable of by expanding on that concept here. The fire arrows were also very underutilized in Ocarina of Time, so it's really great to see them take the spotlight in here. With the fire arrows, this opens up a lot of places that we couldn't explore before. If you use them to open up the northern door in the main room, it will reveal the stairs up to the 3rd floor. But there's nothing we can do up there just yet. Instead, let's backtrack a bit. You can take a shortcut down, and I just learned that if you're curled up in Goron form, you don't take fall damage. The next room we want to go in has technically 3 entry points. There's 2 frozen green doors on the 1st floor central room, or the door in the basement. If you go in the basement door, you can thaw out this Deku flower and fly back up to the 1st floor section of the room. Or you can skip all of that by going through one of these green doors. There's a handful of Freezards who you can one-shot with fire arrows. Defeating them all gives us another stray fairy. You'll want to light all the torches in this room to unlock this door, which takes us into a gated off section of the central room. From here, we can Goron pound this switch down, which raises up the massive central pillar. Okay, Here's the part of the dungeon that most players find themselves getting really stuck on, as there are parts of the pillar you can break to change its height, but you have to be careful when to and when not to do it. If something does happen and you can't progress, there's a second switch in the basement you can pound on to reset the pillar as well. While you're down here, make sure to grab this stray fairy by pressing the button here and grabbing the treasure chest that is somehow not on fire. Ascending up to the top is our next goal, but keep in mind that the dungeon has sprinkled a lot of inaccessible things at us during our first trip upwards, so we'll want to nab all of those with the fire arrows at our disposal. First stop that I recommend is making our way over to the bridge room from the very start of the dungeon and taking out the freezards here. Doing so will give us a treasure chest with a key. If we go back through the foyer and through the blue door, we can now melt the ice in this room to reveal a push block and a switch. Pressing the switch reveals a hidden treasure chest, which we will want to use the push block to move into position so we can climb the ledge up to the chest for another stray fairy. You'll notice the opposite ledge has a door, which again, you'll want to push the block and climb up to. The door takes us back into the room where we found our first key, so we can leap across the blocks and onto that ledge and get the previously inaccessible treasure chest with another stray fairy. Whew. Now, if you go into that bomb chew room where we got the map, you can use fire arrows on the frozen eye switch to create a shortcut back up to the second floor of the central room, which will be really useful if we end up falling by mistake and having to backtrack. There's also another hidden stray fairy in this room, which I recommend removing the bunny hood for so that you don't overshoot your jumps across these platforms. Back upstairs. As tempting as it may be, don't break the pillars just yet. Instead, we'll want to make our way back up to that locked door on the third floor. There's these enemies called Eno, which are easy enough to deal with. Don't miss the hidden fairy in here, which is pretty obvious as well. Melt the ice and head up the stairs. This next room will have you ambushed by 2 dino foes. These guys are pretty tough, but if you're patient and time your attacks, you'll be able to take them on. Each one of them has a stray fairy. Now we'll be back in the central room on the 4th floor. Provided you didn't break the pillar at all, you'll be able to walk right across and into the next door, taking us to a second mid-boss fight against the Wizrobe again. This room is bigger with more platforms for him to appear out of, but don't let that intimidate you. You can use the exact same tactic as before by putting yourself in the corner and sniping him with your bow. After defeating him, you'll be able to nab the boss key. Nice work. The actual boss room is out of reach at the very top of this room. So here's what we need to do. Backtrack down to the 2nd floor and break the 2 slots in the pillar to lower it down. You should be able to ascend the stairs quickly back up to the 3rd floor and break the next 2 slots. This path with the snow boulders will now be accessible, but before we do that, there is one final stray fairy to collect. It's hidden on an alcove between the 2nd and 3rd floor of the central room. The intention here is that you're meant to use the Scarecrow song for this, but we don't have the hook shot yet. Here's what you can do instead. Wearing the bunny hood, if you carefully line yourself up with this line on the top of the pillar and leap straight forward, you should just be able to land the jump into that alcove. If you've been thorough, this should be your final stray fairy before we take on the boss. I really recommend leaving the dungeon to bring the stray fairies back to the fairy fountain just outside the dungeon. Doing so will grant us the expanded magic meter, which is going to be vital for the boss fight. Once you've got that, you can use all the shortcuts that we've created for ourselves to quickly get back through the dungeon to the top floor. You can punch these snow boulders and head up the stairs. It's just one Goron rolling jump across this gap and into the boss door. Upon entering the boss room, we'll find the boss completely frozen in place. There's nothing else we can do but thaw him out with a fire arrow, which will initiate the battle. This is Got. Goat? How do you pronounce? He'll break through the walls in the room and start running. Got is basically like a mechanical bull. Or goat? And I mean mechanical. The N64 does its best to keep him detailed, but looking at his concept art, you can see gears, wires, and metal plating on him. It's a really unique design, the likes of which you don't see too often in classic Zelda. Now, I hate to rag on the 3DS remake so much, because there's some good things they did with that, but why did they suck the life out of him here? Just look at Got's remains side by side. I don't understand the decision to make his colors so much less vibrant. The 3DS version does lean more into the mechanical aspect of his design, but sacrifices some really colorful designs in the process. Anyways, the boss room is basically a giant ring, or like a racetrack. Like with Odolwa, the dungeon item is not needed for this fight. Instead, we'll be using our Goron abilities. You'll want to charge up a Goron roll and take pursuit. Basically, the entire fight is this. You chase him and ram into him with your spikes to deal damage. Just watch out as he will chuck rocks, bombs, and even energy bolts back at you. When you have a charged up roll, it consumes magic power the entire time, which is why having twice the magic power was so important. There are also these green pots around the room, which you can break to refill your magic meter. When you ram into him, he will occasionally be knocked down, and if you're precise enough, you can sort of wedge yourself into his butt or his shoulder to keep dealing a bunch of damage to him while he's down. This can be really satisfying. Honestly, I dig this for how different it is from other boss fights in this series. It's so fast-paced and energetic. It's honestly a ton of fun. Except in the 3DS version, they once again added the giant eyeball. I didn't like this change for Odolwa, but I hate it here. This fight is meant to be a hot pursuit, but by adding the eyeball, they force you to halt the fight and use arrows on him. This might sound good on paper, but all it does is disrupt the pacing of the battle. And for what? Just so they can fix him by making him more like a Zelda boss? By forcing you to stop, it means you also have to charge up your Goron roll every time you land a hit on him, rather than that halt being the penalty for getting hit. What was the punishment for doing poorly in the original version is what you have to do in the remake. I don't get it. Truth be told, this is an issue I have with the 3DS remake overall. They took a lot of what made this game really unique and different and somehow decided that these are things that needed fixing. The fact is, what I love about this game is how bravely it set out to not be Ocarina of Time, but to stand out on its own. But I digress. The original version of this fight is fast-paced and a ton of fun. Keep at it enough and eventually Got will go down and just crash right into the wall. We'll get ourselves that heart container and recover Got's remains. We'll briefly see the second giant and be warped outside to find spring on the mountain. Wonderful. The Gorons are no longer in danger of freezing to death. Just like before, relief. Frog? 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 So, that's the dungeon. Overall, this dungeon is a pretty big step up the difficulty curve compared to Woodfall. But, considering how few dungeons are actually in this game, I can excuse that. It makes wonderful use of vertical space and builds off what Woodfall established with the formula surrounding using a central room to alter the actual dungeon itself, and using the bow as the main item. Though in Woodfall's case, the central room wasn't very large, and the alteration was simply purifying the water. Here, the central room is massive, and the alteration is raising and lowering this pillar. It's taking those ideas and expanding upon them in such unique ways that makes the dungeon design in this game so wonderful. A couple of nitpicks. Most of these stray fairies are too obvious in my opinion, but the ones that aren't are a little too hard to find. In particular, the one hidden in the ceiling here, and the one in that alcove in the central room. That one really bugs me because it seems intentionally designed to be one that you'd have to backtrack to later in the game, forcing me to recommend an unintended exploit to get it. Though getting the upgraded magic meter is totally worthwhile, I just don't like the idea of having to come back to a dungeon that I've already beaten to collect secrets later. Ocarina of Time does it a couple times with gold Skulltulas, and I didn't like it then either. Another weird nitpick, but this room where you have to go find the switch to raise the platform has too many doors. There's no reason to need 3 doors to get in and out of this room, in addition to the one that you use to reach the switch. It's a weird nitpick, but I really feel like having too many options like that can trip up new players who aren't familiar with the dungeon. If they simply removed even just one of those doors, that would simplify it all that much more. But I'd even go as far as taking out 2 of them and just leave the one in the basement. It's the only door down here, aside from the staircase back to the first floor, so that makes it pretty memorable. Besides, the first floor of the central room has 7 doors, so taking out those 2 would make it a little less daunting. Even still, those nitpicks are pretty minor all things considered. I've heard a lot of people say that this dungeon is particularly challenging and frustrating, but truth be told, I like it a lot. Thank you so much for tuning into this video. If you enjoyed it, make sure to subscribe and stay tuned for when the next one comes out. I also just wanted to say a quick thanks to those who supported me on Patreon, particularly those who supported at the cheese tier or higher, which includes Brenda, Tetra, Callie, and Finley. Thank you so much again, you guys, and I will catch you next time. Bye bye.